Welcome everyone. We'll just give everyone until 11:02 to sign in. In another 30 seconds or so, some participants are still logging in and then. Welcome everyone. I'm Liz Duffy, Regional Resource Director for Florida at Caron Treatment Centers. Thank you for joining us for our 9th webinar in our View from the Mountain webinar series in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Today's presentation is eligible for 1 hour of social work continuing education credit. We would like to thank our educational sponsor, Jumana Grassi, for assisting us in obtaining these credits. Ryan. Please keep your Zoom session open at the end of the presentation to access the post-event evaluation in order to obtain your credit. In order to receive credit, you must remain on this presentation throughout the duration. A certificate will be emailed to you directly from Jumana within the next 2 weeks. As a reminder, we will be conducting the session in webinar format. All participants' microphones will be muted. Depending on the volume of questions, if we can't get to your question before the end of the hour, we will have somebody from our team follow up with you directly. If you would like to submit a question, please utilize the Q&A. Now, I would like to welcome our speaker today, Ryan Hansen. Ryan is the Executive Director of Caron Renaissance. In his role, Ryan supervises leadership staff, oversees daily operations, provides clinical oversight, and works directly with patients, families, and referrents to strengthen collaborative relationships. He also assists in the development and implementation of new clinical offerings, including the Caron Renaissance Digital Dorm. Ryan has worked with multiple populations and levels of care. These include teen mental health, teen residential, chemical dependency, adult chemical dependency, and mental health, adult intensive outpatient mental health, adult intensive outpatient chemical dependency, treatment, case management, private practice, halfway house, and vocational. He has been with Caron Renaissance since 2010 and has worked as a case specialist in our admissions department, as both a primary and family therapist, as well as the Director of Family Services at Caron Renaissance. Please welcome Ryan Hansen.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks everyone for being here. I really appreciate you all taking the time out of your busy schedules to be a part of this webinar series and the presentation today. A few disclaimers. I tend to talk pretty quickly at times, and I tend to ad-lib, so I'm not always referencing the exact slide that is up, but if anyone wants any of the PowerPoint slides or the entire presentation after, we're happy to provide it to you. There's no secret information in there if we're already presenting on it. So this really is an emerging field, and there are a lot of people who've been working in it, but it seems strange to call it an emerging field when really we think back to the advent of Alan Turing developing computers during World War II, up through the increased access to the internet in the 80s and 90s, and finally nearly instant access and accessibility for everyone who can afford an iPhone or a BlackBerry once we got into the 2000s. You know, we now have a population that's incredibly used to having a normalized level of instantaneous access to resources, good and bad. And it's a little disconcerting at times that ICD-11 really hasn't formalized this diagnosis until just recently, and that DSM-5 is still working on formalizing it. But it really does allow us to talk about some groundbreaking work that's happening and things that we know are impacting ourselves, our loved ones, and the patients and families that we work with. Now, this presentation is influenced by a number of years of treating process-driven disorders, as well as treating failure to launch young adults, and asking how we can treat this population more effectively. a few years ago, we started partnering with Dr. Clifford Sussman to really talk about how we could formalize our treatment of digital use disorders and to not just focus on gaming. There's a lot of research, and I'll talk about that later, but there's a lot of research that focuses specifically on gaming, but that's only a subset of internet use disorders. Now, and experience shows us that generationally, different groups are affected. They utilize different media, and the assessment strategies we need to use in order to assist them are slightly different. So, most of us are familiar with the essential components of a substance use disorder, and the criteria for assigning a diagnosis requires that we evaluate a true holistic life pattern, and that we're not just looking at the amount of a chemical used. We're looking at the impact that it has on a variety of life areas. And the same thing is true when we start talking about gaming disorder and internet use disorders, is that we need to look at more than just the time spent online and look at the impact in different life areas, that we need to talk about assessments being more thorough and being more holistic. And I mentioned that different generations tend to use their resources differently. So it's not just about time, it's about the impact that it's having in a variety of ways. So if we look at my generation, for example, we're not talking just about gaming. We're talking about social media use. We're talking about Candy Crush or online shopping, online gambling. If we talk about the generation ahead of me, we're looking at some of those same categories. We're also looking at news media and chat rooms and somebody engaging in order to find a connection, in part to replace potential losses, whether those are career or relationships or deaths within that generation. So helping our clinicians, helping our family members understand that it's important to screen all generations for their digital use and their digital use patterns. Now, we've been doing this for a little while, and some of the things that we look at aren't clearly represented in some of the diagnostic criteria. I mean, we can find ways to lump them in, but when we get calls from families, these are some of the things that they really start talking to us about. And those, they're less formal, is really talking about money. Money that has been spent, money that has been misspent, money that has been stolen. And again, we're talking multi-generationally, not just young adults when we're talking about misappropriated funds. These are so that someone can buy up in particular games or create loot boxes or use it for online shopping or online gambling or to send to their new relationship that they've developed across the seas. Now, these are things that we know happen, but they are identifiable characteristics that we can help families understand, and we help individuals understand that these are patterns that we see with digital use disorders. I also think it's really important to talk about violence that happens, because as we go through this presentation, we talk about some of the increased use, and we talk about what happens after our COVID reality, and we start to ask people to pull away from some of their digital media. Many times, family members and caregivers are at risk for potential violent fallout when they're asking someone to pull back, or they're actually physically taking some of the items, whether they be phones or computers, or turning off Wi-Fi, or doing things like that. So again, it's an identifiable pattern. And we're also looking at the things that families tell us, that they're watching individuals either regress and pull away and isolate socially, or watching people not move ahead developmentally the same way some of their same-aged peers are. Now, I mentioned the World Health Organization and that they formalized the gaming disorder criteria and diagnosis. And it's not inconsistent from the DSM-5 diagnoses and criteria, but I think it's important to identify that we're talking about a pattern of behavior over a 12-month period. And so as we talk about some of the COVID-related issues and increased use of Zoom and TikTok and everything else that people are engaging in. Right now, we're only talking about the last 3 to 4 month increase. And I'll get into some of the numbers, but we will see those numbers go up dramatically. And those are things that we need to be talking about. But if we're going to apply the strict criteria, we need to be aware that somebody may not meet a full diagnosis. They certainly may still need some support and some intervention. I mentioned this particular question on whether or not gaming qualifies as a career, specifically because we have been working in helping folks understand the differences and the similarities between, for example, if someone came to us and said, I want to be a professional gymnast, or I'd like to be a professional football player, or I'd like to be a professional gambler. These are all legitimate careers. Professional gaming also qualifies as a career. And the same caveats and concerns that we would have about someone spending 6 to 8 hours a day in a gym, families paying for coaches, gymnasts, trainers, in order to help them along that particular potential career path, we'd be talking about some of the same concerns of, is this becoming too narrow? How are the other areas of this particular person's life development happening? We've worked with families that the individual has said to them, I'm ranked number 400 right now. And if I break into the top 250, I can get corporate sponsorship. And those are real statements. The reality is, we're talking about a very small percentage, the same way we'd be talking about a very small percentage for any other professional level of excellence. There are national and international sponsorships, there are tournaments, there's prize money available. All of these things are incredibly alluring. I think the differences that we have to talk about that may not apply to someone who wants to be a professional gymnast is there has to be a certain level of physical skill. And there does in this career as well. And for most of us, it's a very difficult time to be able to understand what would someone do to get better. There are schools that you can go to in South Korea that will help you understand some of that, if that's a career path that someone wants to take. But it's something that most of us have some discomfort around, not only because of its novelty, but also because we aren't certain if we're putting somebody at risk to be potentially addicted and to have some of these other areas of life impact. But it's important to be talking about when somebody brings this forward, that this may be grounded in some version of reality. I also, when we're talking about digital use, I want to just briefly mention some things about texting and driving. And I will put out the disclaimer that I absolutely have texted while behind the wheel on the freeway in my residential neighborhood. But I think we can also help families to understand and model that they don't have to be perfect. And in fact, addressing some of the potential inconsistencies and addressing some of the potential narcissistic shame around making mistakes offers an opportunity to model for families that we haven't had to have been perfect, and that we sometimes make decisions. And when we gain new information, it doesn't mean that we can't go back and address some of those decisions that we've already made, especially when we gain information that allows us to make new, better, and healthier decisions today. We tell families all the time, you get the right to change your mind. So even if you've agreed to something and you realize now that wasn't a very good idea, or that's not turning out the way that we wanted, I don't have to be married to that particular decision for the rest of my life. I get the right to make some changes around it. So some quick statistics around texting and driving. 25% of auto accidents involve the use of a cell phone. So more than a quarter of all auto accidents are involving a cell phone. And part of the reason for that is the National Highway Safety and Transportation Administration has done studies that if 2 seconds is the reasonable amount of time that I can look away from the road, whether it's to change the radio station or check what my daughter is doing in the back seat, or just simply be distracted with something else happening in another lane of traffic. Before I look back and reasonably, I can probably react in a safe manner despite what's happened ahead of me. The problem with that is that the average time it takes for somebody to text is 5 seconds. So more than double the amount of time, I've now looked away. And so now my reaction time is cut, putting more people at risk on the roads. And this becomes relevant because more than 10 teens a day are dying. So roughly 5,000 or 4,000 teens per year are dying because of texting and driving, in addition to all the other injuries and accidents that are happening. So it really is a fatal issue. So I want to talk about just kind of why tech is so addictive. And I'll put the disclaimer on here that I'm not a doctor. I'm going to talk a little bit about neurons and dopamine and some other things, but from an overview standpoint and in a practical way, so that we kind of help ourselves and help families and individuals that we might be working with understand why this is so powerful. It's immediately stimulating. We know from chemical use disorders that the faster the means of administration, the more quickly and more powerfully the brain remembers it. Now, the same is true for digital media and intermittent reinforcement of digital media. So there's very little filter in between what's happening on the screen in front of me and my brain's immediate absorption of it. It doesn't mean that all things digital are addictive, but it does mean that I'm being immediately stimulated. And now, if somebody is utilizing some intermittent reinforcement, and you need to look no further than your Facebook feed in order to see what intermittent reinforcement is I don't know as I scroll through it what's going to pop up next. I don't know. Facebook has an entire algorithm on what stories and what individuals they believe will keep you scrolling. And generally speaking, they're correct. So there's an intermittent reinforcement pattern. There might be 20 things I scroll through that I find boring, but I keep scrolling because I know I'm going to find the one that isn't boring. So that pattern is happening for me. Gaming is exactly the same thing. As I'm playing Candy Crush, and I start to see that things are popping at the exact same amount or popping less, the game itself will suddenly shoot something bigger. It'll give me a good job. It'll pop something bigger, and because it rewards me suddenly, and now I'm more interested and I continue to play. It's happening very, very fast. And so the dopamine, the intensity of the dopamine pathways are absolutely rolling. Now we talk about, just very quickly, the neuronal network and dopamine in between the synapses. Our brains are supposed to produce dopamine. It's our feel-good chemical. But when we're receiving outside triggers and outside stimulus that is pushing our dopamine production beyond what it would normally be, our brain stops producing dopamine the same way that it would. It relies on us to get the stimulus from somewhere else. And now I start to develop tolerance. And so my brain is not producing it. So now when I take the stimulus away, whether that was bungee jumping or gaming or drugs and alcohol, my brain is left repairing and I don't feel as good. And so I either have to experience and tolerate that discomfort in order for my brain to repair, or I'm going to have to put in more of that previous stimulus in order to get back to where I feel good. So as we talk about some of the brain development, and again, I'm going to simplify this for my purposes. The lower part of our brain, the more basic part of our brain that's more autonomic and is designed to react very, very quickly for life-saving reasons. If I see a Tyrannosaurus Rex, I need to run. I don't need to think about how big it is, what color it is, wonder where it came from, decide if I have the right shoes on. All I need to do is run as fast as I can. That neuronal process is incredibly fast. If we spaced out the neurons and did a miles per hour analysis, we're talking about 250 miles per hour. That's how fast our brain is firing so that I can save my life. The brakes of the brain, the front part of the brain where I evaluate things, where I problem solve, where I think things through, is actually only operating in between 100 and 150 miles an hour. So I need to have a really fully developed front part of my brain and have some life experience in order to not run every time I see something, or to not grab something, or to want to have sex with something. Like I need the front part of my brain to be able to help me decide, is this a good idea right now? So when we're talking about brain development, we're talking about powerful and immediate stimulus and the tools to manage that. And the people that have that the least, the people that are at highest risk for some poor decision making, are adolescents and young adults, because the front part of their brain is simply not as developed yet. They're just biologically, they're not there. Folks with ADHD, because again, their brain is looking for a higher level of stimulus and is less able to focus. And folks with any other type of use disorder, because they're already primed to get some of that stimulation from an outside source. And so their brain's already looking for it. I mentioned, the next two slides are just to very briefly mention that we have lots and lots of different categories that people are gaming at. And I don't think it's necessary to kind of go through them all. What I do think is relevant as we talk about this is that there is a social aspect to multiplayer games. And if you talk to people who are engaged in them, they will identify, look, for example, I attended a concert last night. It happened to be online and 50,000 people were there. So is that the same level of social engagement as, you know, me getting on Zoom and talking to my parents? You know, and certainly there are differences, but it is a reality of some people's lives that is part of their social engagement. Again, we're going to talk throughout this presentation about balance and the importance of, if somebody is engaged in that type of social activity, that's not necessarily wrong, it's fine, as long as they also have some corresponding social engagement in the quote real world. So when we talk about treatment issues and really starting to assess whether or not someone is having some problematic use, one of the things that we talk about are time distortions. And most of us can relate to this because we've been on Facebook, we've been on some type of social media, we've been on ESPN, and we've been scrolling through things, and all of a sudden we look up and it's 30 minutes later. Or, we were gonna, if you've done it at a red light, suddenly you realize somebody is honking because we've lost focus and we've lost time. And that's consistent with most use disorders, whether we're talking about process-driven disorders or chemical use disorders, is that people lose time. So helping people take a look at, and really doing some inventories of where their time is going. For some people, it can be useful to use things like the screen time feature on an iPhone, because it will categorize for you where your online use has been. If somebody is active and engaged in a treatment process, something like that can be really helpful. As we look at things that are the same and things that have changed in the past 3 to 4 months, the average use of smartphones 4 months ago was 5.5 hours. Teens were at about 9 hours a day. Kids 8 to 12 were 6 hours a day. Those numbers have gone up. And in some cases, they've gone up significantly. Social media use has increased by more than 50% since the beginning of March. Gaming platforms have increased by 75% since March. So if we know that, if I know that I haven't been on the upper end of that average, it means someone else has been using even more in order for us to get to some of those numbers. And these are the folks that likely, as we hope to come out of the other side of this COVID pandemic, these are the folks that are really going to struggle. They're not only is the dopamine depletion going to leave them lethargic, it means they've probably been less engaged socially. It means they've probably been less active physically. It means they may or may not have been taking good care of themselves nutritionally. So all of these factors combine to get individuals and families to a place where they're likely to struggle. And one of the things that I think we can be helpful with our families is helping them to understand that it is not too early to start asking questions. I think many times when I'm talking to families right now, the fear is, well, if I take away their media, if I take away their technology or their access to things, what are they going to have to do? And that's a real question, but it's also that I'd rather have people start talking about than simply saying, well, I'll wait until later. Because it's not, if we can interrupt the process earlier, there's more likelihood that that interruption is going to be successful. So that requires a level of assessment. And I like to point out some of the areas that, as we're doing thorough screenings and thorough individualized work with families, these are some of the areas we want people to be aware of that are many times running concurrent with potential digital use disorders. Autism spectrum disorders, when we think about some of the hallmarks of autism, that some of that is difficulty reading social cues and difficulty reading facial features and understanding some of the nuances of those things. During a screen interaction or a one-way screen interaction, I'm less likely to be uncomfortable. So it actually, for someone who has some potential mild ASD, this might actually decrease some of my social anxiety. It might help level the playing field. So it's understandable why it might be valid. And it's important that we understand that that's part of what might be driving this. ADHD, and again, if I'm looking for consistent stimulation, online resources are a gold rush for me to gain dopamine. Anxiety and depression. We think about the fact that if those anxiety or depression were there before I started using digital media, it might be part of the underlying issue driving my use. If they're starting to present after, it may be because some of my other life areas are struggling and I'm recognizing that. I'm feeling sad about it, I'm feeling concerned about it, and therefore I have an interactive or a spiral effect happening. And certainly, we've mentioned if folks have other process-driven disorders or other substance use disorders, their brains are more likely to be susceptible to another type of disorder. So these are some of the tools that we use when we're thinking about assessment, and we're thinking about individualized assessment. And this isn't a comprehensive list. It's not designed to be, and we always want people to be thoughtful about doing something in an individualized way and really meeting the individual or the family that they're working with where they are. So a few of the things that I really want to focus on, though, are the family screen use assessment and family systems assessment. We want to be able to look at the whole family system and the family's level of functioning and environmental functioning, doing a thorough biopsychosocial spiritual assessment, understanding where someone is medically, understanding where they are psychologically, doing a full psychological evaluation, potentially looking at personality features through projective testing, so through neuropsychological batteries, educational inventories, vocational inventories, not only to understand where someone is in their life, but also what potential impact they may have had. Have they lost things as a result of their digital or online use? We talk about balance and abstinence. And again, this is a process-driven disorder. So the reality of our society is that we're probably going to need to have some level of technological access. So the all or nothing approach can be a challenging one when we're talking about digital disorders. In order to be effective, somebody probably has to be able to access a computer at times, either due to work or even to access train and bus schedules. So we need to actually help people find balance. And that isn't to say that somebody who has had a specific area of problematic use, whether that's a specific game that they've spent years playing that has really caused some detrimental impact, online pornography, for example. Those are things that someone potentially can cut out of their life. They we're still going to have to help them with triggers and coping strategies around that, because those things are still around, but they don't necessarily have to engage in that. Someone's probably going to need a phone. They're going to need to have access to a phone. There's a whole area of growth that has happened in the market around, this is a somewhat pejorative term, but dumb phones. And technology that doesn't have all the bells and whistles and doesn't have immediate internet access, so that people can have some of the tools that, quite simply, we had 20 years ago. My first cell phone had no internet access. In fact, most of the time it barely had cell phone service. But those are some of the tools that individuals at times are going to need in order to both get settled and to develop some tools as they move forward. Now, I mention high dopamine activities just because I want us to be able to differentiate that as we're talking about some of the treatment strategies. So the high dopamine activities are the things that give us the big rush, both on screen and off screen. Low dopamine activities are the things that require some more delayed gratification. They're the things that I have to think about. Those are the things that I may have to do some problem solving. Those are the things that I don't get the burst of dopamine until I get toward the end of the process. And then it's some self-congratulation and some pride in accomplishing a series of tasks as opposed to an immediate boost. So when we're talking about treating digital disorders, we have approached this through 3 specific phases: digital detox, getting somebody's brain and body balanced and healthy, developing some balance through external regulation and having some support, and then eventually internalizing those skills and tools. And I'll talk a little bit about each. So when we're talking about digital detox, we need to allow the brain to heal and start producing its own dopamine again. And what we've found is that 90% of normal dopamine production generally can return in a week with the removal of some of those external triggers. Now, that of course can be incredibly individualized and depends on the length of someone's use, as well as whether or not they've been combining digital use with chemicals. Methamphetamine is a great example of that. The supraphysiological dopamine surge from methamphetamine is off the charts. Long-term use of stimulants can slow this process down. But we need to allow somebody to come away from their cues and their triggers so that their brain can start doing some healing. Now, depending on the level of somebody's use, some people can do this on an outpatient basis. Some people can turn their technology into another loved one to hold on to for a week, while they let their brain go. Some people need a residential setting in order to have enough support in order to do that effectively. And in this setting, we see detox. Individuals who need this level of care will also seek out their drug of choice, so to speak, even while they're in detox. So they may try and convince someone else to let them use their phone. They may look for screens elsewhere. They may try and sneak into offices. These are the things that happen. So we need to be prepared for some of those things. And we use them like we would any other relapse. And we go back and it's a learning process. And we help see the intensity of the trigger and we start the detox process over. When we start talking about how do we implement some external regulation, it's a real opportunity to help people grow and develop some skills, and it needs an enormous amount of structure. We slowly reintroduce with structure and some support components based on that individual's needs and background. I wouldn't hand a phone with internet access to a gambler who typically used their phone to gamble, certainly not in the beginning stages of this. But I might hand some of that dumb technology, a flip phone, to someone during a group, for example. And I might have them stick it in their pocket. And then toward the end of the group and what thoughts and cravings they've been experiencing as they've had access, such as it is, to technology. And growing slowly based on some of their responses with those things? Can they develop some tools? Can they develop some strategies around how would they talk about that? How have they been distracted? Did they utilize their support system? Is it evidence that they need a better support system? Helping them during that process requires a great deal of structure, support, and understanding, but it also bears great dividends. We want to help people create tools that they're going to be able to implement in some very practical ways. And some of those ways, they're able to do so quickly, and some of those things less so. We also want to help somebody look at their environment. If somebody was highly triggered at work, if they were a computer programmer, for example, starting to figure out, is that doing some career assessments, figuring out things like, are those things going to be sustainable long-term? If so, how can I develop some tools and some structure around that? Do I need to involve my HR department? If I'm a college student and I need to go back to school, is the dorm going to be a safe living environment for me with its lack of structure, or do I need some supportive housing? How can I involve the dean's office in that, et cetera? So we're helping individuals to look at all of that when we're thinking about, that type of exposure and how we can safely help them implement this into their lives. And the goal, of course, becomes getting someone to an eventual place where they are doing these things regularly enough and developing tools around how this applies to them, that their life is continuing and all those other areas of balance in their life are continuing, and they start to develop some of the internal structures to get there. I've noted a few things here that in general are great ideas for most of us. That they're more supportive of sleep and overall health. This is not just for somebody who's struggling with a digital use disorder, but things like screen-free meals and us being engaged with each other at mealtime, as well as making sure that our sleep is uninterrupted. So getting us to self-regulation as an individual continues to practice with a lot of structure and support, having them become more self-directed so that they can create their plan of activity for the day, so that they have tools in their back pocket on how can I reach out to my support network when I get triggered. It's not if I get triggered, it's when I get triggered. And developing boundaries with families on what their level of impact should be and what their level of involvement should be. There's an important process with families on helping families understand what can be supportive as well as what can be intrusive or enabling. We talk about some of the specific clinical modalities that we use, and we want to talk about evidence-based protocols. So we're talking about CBT, and we're talking about, essentially it's impact and effectiveness in gambling. And we've extrapolated much of what we do with gaming and internet use disorders from gambling treatment, because the distortions are very similar, the time loss is very similar, and some of the cognitive restructuring that needs to happen is very similar. We talk about the importance of involving family systems and doing family systems treatment. We know that when we do that type of parallel work, that it not only helps from an environmental standpoint, but it helps from a family norms standpoint. And sometimes family members have not had an opportunity to look at their own potential use disorders and their own need for some additional coping strategies. I mentioned Prochaska and DiClemente's stages of change, just because motivational interviewing is also very important. We're meeting people where they're at. When we're talking about, and I'll use young adults as an example, helping somebody move into adulthood, someone who's currently living in the basement and hasn't been out of the house for 3 months, immediately jumping to how can we help you get a job or get re-engaged in school might be too big of a jump. So we might have to both help the family understand what a reasonable stage is, as well as help that individual to set some achievable goals, as well as to help them move along the spectrum when they're less interested in doing so. I talked briefly at the beginning about research, and most of the research, if we go back 30 years ago and we think about the research that was being done, we were talking about research on pornography. The initial question wasn't whether or not internet or computers were addictive, it was whether or not the things we were watching on them were addictive. And certainly we know that they are. But those things were being done primarily in private therapists' offices, in individual therapy, group therapy, on an outpatient basis. And we've extrapolated that wealth of data, we've extrapolated that now to understand that some of our folks need residential levels of care, either because of the many life areas that are being affected or because of the intensity of what they're experiencing with this particular issue. And again, much of that has been built off of gambling treatment. You know, cognitive behavioral therapy, we've spent some time talking about it, but it really is a critical foundational piece for what we're doing. You know, as we look at some of the exposure work that has to happen, and really helping people understand that they need to change their thinking as well as changing their behaviors. There are underlying belief systems that can be very hardwired into all of us, and especially when somebody has a view of the world of it's not exciting unless I have this, whatever this might be for them, you know, helping them to reframe and find some things that are motivating. Self-help groups for families as well as for individuals, and developing the things that they will need in order to be effective. I mentioned some of the medical and medication issues just because I want to highlight two things. One, and I literally highlighted, is not to discount the need for nutrition, adequate sleep, and exercise. We've got to be able to take care of our bodies, both from a healing the brain standpoint, but also because otherwise we're more susceptible to other issues. And also that we need to really do thorough assessments and make sure that we're treating the whole person and not leaving an undiagnosed or unaddressed issue to the side in order to hamstring somebody later in their treatment process. We talk about family treatment and you know, especially now during COVID, thinking about, you know, the individual that says, well, I'm bored. And all of us have experienced that, and sometimes the electronic babysitter or the ease of disconnecting is really significant. But we also want to be thoughtful of how can we help the individuals around us gain some mastery in some other areas. And there's no substitute for our personal connection, and especially with the people living in our homes. We need to make sure that we are talking, that we are communicating. It's communication skills are what we spend an enormous amount of time on in a treatment setting, in an individual therapist's office. You know, we need to learn how to communicate, and we can't do that if we're not actually communicating with each other. When we're separated by distance, you know, a substitute is doing some of the Zoom or online meetings or Facebook Live or some of those things. And we also need to, if possible, balance it out with some other things. I throw in just some issues around communication that we need to talk about splitting and really making sure that families are using some of the same strategies. And I just like any opportunity I have to throw pictures of my cat and my baby into the mix. I've completely hijacked the presentation at this point. The last thing that I want to talk about before we wrap up is to just really highlight how difficult it can be for families to have some clear guidelines. And so I threw in the 2018 guidelines from the American Association of Pediatrics, and an organization that is committed to doing nothing but trying to help kids. And if we look at some of the ambiguity that's present here, and some of the there's not a list of guidelines here. There's an umbrella list. And so even in 2019, when they expanded it to give some time limits, what qualifies as healthy use? And again, time is not the only criteria that we're looking at when we're looking at problem use behaviors. So I want to empathize with how confusing some of this can be, even when we're talking about some of the professional guidance that we're getting. So I encourage people, ask questions, talk about it, call in, talk to somebody who understands some of this, find a Dr. Sussman or a Dr. Greenfield or a variety of other people who have some expertise if you have concerns about your own use or about your loved one's use. Or just from a parenting perspective, and you're wondering how much is too much, or is it safe to let them be on the iPad when we go out to eat? These are reasonable questions right now. And the final slide that I put in here is just a cautionary one. There are lots of apps and lots of monitoring strategies that parents can use. But if you're genuinely concerned about your loved one's use, I would encourage you to go more low tech than this, because most people who are really savvy digitally are going to find a way around some of these things. Whereas if we're giving some basic guidelines of you can use your phone or your laptop for 30 minutes, or you can use it for an hour, and then that has to be followed by a non-digital hour. It's much easier to monitor the non-digital hour, because then all I have to do is just see that you're in the yard. I just have to see that you're not with your phone, or your phone's been placed back on the counter. All of these are options, but for many of the folks that we work with, these are options that the individual can outpace their family and their loved ones faster than we can keep up. So I think I will turn it back over to Liz and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Ryan. We received a bunch of really excellent questions that we would like to take an opportunity to hopefully have you answer. The first one is, this has become a serious addiction for young and old alike. Why is there not more help and resources available?
I think some of it is the fact that the initial research, like I said, it started with doing research on pornography, and specifically started in doing research on pornography with men, and specifically young men, and has grown out of that. So the research itself was biased both from an age and a gender standpoint. And so as we've started to expand our understanding, we've realized that many people are being impacted by digital use disorders. But we're still educating ourselves as a country, we're still educating ourselves as professionals that we have an obligation to be screening all folks that come through our door. Caron's older adult unit in Pennsylvania is a really great example of incorporating some of this type of technology and screening. We don't always think about our elder adults, our senior population as potentially having tech addiction or tech use issues. But we find out that when we start asking questions about the way they're using some of these things, even if they came into treatment because of an alcohol use disorder, or a benzodiazepine use disorder, or a medical issue, that they might also have been struggling with connection and feeling lonely and feeling isolated, and that their technology was one of the only ways that they could do that. So we're learning more about it. And Liz, as you know, when we talked about the fact that we're looking at impact on other life areas, someone who's generally functional and still has their job, but then goes home and plays Candy Crush for 5 hours because they have given up some of their social relationships, or their anxiety has gotten worse, or those two things are connected. We don't always ask those questions. So the person coming into our office now who says, I feel really isolated, or I'm having kind of my midlife crisis, or I feel spiritually disconnected, we're now starting to ask some of those questions, and I'm thrilled about the opportunities to have these kinds of conversations, because they allow us to ask those questions more frequently. And I think as a professional community, we're doing a better job of that, but we're at the front end of this. Whereas in other areas of our field, we've had many, many more years of application.
Thank you, Ryan. Next question is, are there strategies parents can use at home to help adolescents and teens with digital use disorder?
Yes, absolutely. And I think some of the practical things generally tend to work the best. Having the family conversations on what things are acceptable to be accessing online is a good place to start. Having conversations around what balance looks like in our home, those are good places to start. And being able to identify that there needs to be a balance between online activities and offline activities, and that generally speaking, the offline activities need to outweigh the online activities. Those are some basic things, but they're things that families can get started talking about right away.
And just to follow up from that, how can we as professionals support parents of these adolescents and teens?
So being open to the conversation and understanding that digital use in itself is not a bad thing. In fact, digital use and social connection through digital media is part of our reality today. So helping parents understand that asking some of the questions and helping them to learn more in areas that they may not understand. We don't always understand this stuff, and it's okay not to. But that it's, especially as parents, it's really incumbent upon us to start learning some more things and to be having conversations with our kids about this, especially when we're talking about kids that are still living at home. Being able to have conversations helps set the stage for an understanding that it's appropriate to have boundaries and limits, and that these topics are important and need to be talked about, and that we're going to work together on them.
Thank you, Ryan. I know that you kind of touched on this during your presentation, but just to highlight, do you think that digital use disorder is increasing due to mandated quarantine and social distancing?
Yeah, absolutely. Across the board, digital use has increased in the past 3 months. And so that in and of itself is not a problem. However, many families and many individuals are realizing that their life is becoming much smaller, and the sooner that they and we intervene on that and start offering some support and some guidance and some options and tools, the more likely it is that it will not become the long-term problem.
Thank you. And just kind of to go off of what the new norm is teletherapy available to treat this?
Yes. And in fact, due to the pandemic, telehealth rules have been shifted slightly. And so generally speaking, they were regulated by state. And in fact, with some of the federal guidelines now being shifted, you can work with a provider anywhere. And so there are a lot of very, very qualified professionals who you can access in order to start having some of these conversations and gain information and talk about your use or your loved one's use, and gain support without ever having to leave your house. And those are some great starting points for people.
Thank you. Please define what is considered digital. Does this include a smart TV?
So smart TVs produce blue light, and you can access YouTube and TikTok and all sorts of other things on them. And I think, as we talk about digital, it all falls into the same category. Now, it's less likely that you're going to get addicted to watching Gilligan's Island reruns
I don't know about that, but
than things with intermittent reinforcement. So we're looking at things that shift the value and the intensity, and those are the things that are more likely to become addictive. However, all of it is activating. All blue light is activating. So your brain is reacting to it, which again is why we talk about bedtime routines and not accessing screens, at least in the hour before you go to bed, and having them out of the bedroom. But yes, smart TVs are digital, but really what we're talking about is the content of what we're watching.
Thank you. And I know we assess for ADHD, but what do you recommend for those who have this disorder along with a confirmed diagnosis of ADHD?
Well, and again, that becomes an individualized question, but if we're talking about it generally, we're talking about making sure that we treat all of our conditions. So if I know that attentional issues are part of my treatment plan, whether that is learning some things cognitively, learning some tools about how to stay focused or how to break my workload up into smaller, more manageable pieces in order to be more effective, or whether that's using a medication effectively and as prescribed in order to help me, that's fine. But it's important that we're talking about treating all of our issues concurrently. And so working with providers that understand that, so that I don't have, my psychiatrist over on one hand and my individual therapist over here and my sponsor or my support network over here. The more I can bring those things into harmony and work together on all of my issues, the more likely I can have an effective biopsychosocial, spiritual recovery.
That makes sense. Thank you, Ryan. I believe we'll have time for about one more. In terms of video games, what is the recommendations for limits with kids who fellowship, socialize, connect over this platform during the pandemic?
So we can look at some of the AAP guidelines as far as amount of time spent online. But really working with families, what we really ask them to start looking at is not just the amount of time spent online, it's really the amount of life engagement and balance that someone has when they're offline. So are they being successful in school? Do they have friendships and relationships in an offline world? Are they engaged as a family member? Do they participate in family activities? If those things are happening and they are engaged in social activities and gaming online, that individual that we're talking about has some balance and they're progressing developmentally. Probably not the concern that I would have. If, however, those other areas are lagging as a result of the online use, then I would encourage a parent or a family to start talking to someone and to start figuring out ways that they can help that individual set some limits and get engaged in some other activities.
Thank you, Ryan. We're just about out of time and we still have a bunch of wonderful questions that I'll be sending you, and hopefully we can reach out to all of our awesome participants who submitted them directly and answer them for them. So just as a reminder, we are offering continuing education credits for social workers. The survey will be posted for you to take immediately following this presentation in order to obtain credits. Again, you must have been on for the duration of the presentation to get the credit. You will receive a certification of completion in the next couple weeks. And in honor of Memorial Day holiday next week, we will not be hosting our weekly webinar, but we hope you will join us for our next installment in our series on Tuesday, June 2nd. Watch your emails for more details. In the meantime, please remember to reach out to your local regional resource director for any additional information or questions. Ryan, can you just click over to the next slide for that information?
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us and have a great afternoon.